Hi everyone, welcome to the final session of the Virtual Cafe Summer Speaker Series. As you can see, I am for once on the right side of the screen and there's no one to my left. I am by myself today. I wanted to finish off the Summer Speaker Series with a topic presented all by myself. I've spent the last 12 weeks enjoying the company of others, learning from others in areas that I both work in and don't know much about. So it's been a really enjoyable process for me to learn in areas that I maybe dabble in, but also to experience areas that I don't at all, and then to also just be able to share this information with you. So I've really enjoyed the speaker series, and I hope you've all gotten something out of it. And well done if you've stuck with us the whole way and you've made it this far. As I've said at the start, these sessions will be available to be watched throughout 2023. So please don't feel like you need to rush through them. Take your time, rewatch them as many times as you would like. I would also love some feedback as well. So if you enjoyed any of the past presentations, feel free to write in the comments or give it a like. And that way we know what really took your fancy throughout the summer speaker series, because then we can utilize that information to look at bringing you workshops in the future. Anyway, enough about that. Today, I wanted to talk about a topic that was requested quite a lot towards the end of last year. We brought out a blog on this topic, which was about disability. And at the request of the pole and aerial community, I am doing this video today. Specifically, there's so much that came up actually during that series. We really touched the surface on the disabled community. There's so much information and opinion out there, and I learned a lot throughout that process. Caitlin, who authored the blog, learned a lot throughout that process. We had such an incredible time chatting to members of the pole and aerial community, learning from them directly and utilizing resources to pull that series together, and making changes throughout the series as we were learning on the way. So there was so much information with it, but one thing that really stuck with us was when we talk about disability, a lot of people feel a little bit tentative when it comes to teaching a disabled polar, because they don't have a medical background or medical understanding. They wanted to sort of know how to best approach it. It's okay if you feel that way. My goal today is that throughout our session is to help you feel more comfortable and confident as an instructor, or even as a student if you're wanting to learn, or you might be a future instructor one day, but just to feel more confident in your abilities when it comes to teaching disabled polars how to pole. So really today what we're going to be covering is the considerations when teaching a disabled polar. I myself, I'm not disabled, so obviously I will bring that forward as disclaimer. So I'm not speaking from the point of view of someone who has dealt personally with some of the issues I'll be talking through today. I did, like I said, last year draw on amazing knowledge bank of so many disabled polars and aerialists within our community. I had many reach out to me directly to add in their thoughts and opinions. So there is a lot of information I really would love to present. There are some parts of today that are a little bit more personal opinion. Not my personal opinion, but the opinion of a small collective of people within the pole and aerial community that hopefully reflect the greater community. I appreciate that there may be some who are watching who are disabled who don't necessarily feel that way, doesn't align with them, and that's okay. I just want to flag that to start, that I'm trying to provide as much information as I can that represents the disabled community as best as possible, but it may not speak to every individual within the community. So I'll talk about bits and pieces along the way, but I did want to flag that. But I'll do my best, and I hope for anyone who's watching this that is disabled, I hope that you appreciate this talk, and I hope it does you proud to some bits. I really want to just try and provide some degree of a voice out there for the pole and aerial community, because I am very blessed to have this platform to be able to share information with. So we really do try to use this platform for positive change within the community, and the disability series was certainly a big one last year that really helped, I think, bring a lot of information to light within the pole and aerial community. Okay, I will stop rambling and start talking about the key points of today. So first of all, we all pole dance because usually it makes us feel something. It makes us feel empowered. We love that sensation of freedom, whether it's emotional freedom, physical freedom, whatever it is individually for us, it makes us feel something. And so this is no different for any other person out there, whether they are disabled or not disabled. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, that people are drawn to pole because it helps them feel empowered. It helps them provide expression. So when we talk about disability in pole dance, so you have probably heard me already say disabled polar, and this is terminology that I guess I want to outlay from the start. First of all, disabled is not a dirty word. That's probably the first thing I want to say. A lot of people out there who are able-bodied sort of go, oh, is that okay? Is that politically correct to say? Yes, it is. So utilizing the word disability is politically correct. Sorry, I will turn off my Facebook notifications there. There we go. Disability is not a dirty word to say. However, there are some individuals within the pole community that have preference for terminology that's slightly different. So there are two key phrases that is utilized, and this is something that I certainly found last year. It came down to individual preference. So some people like to be referred as a disabled pole dancer, and other people like to be referred to as a pole dancer with disability. They are slightly different terminology, as you can see. So disabled pole dancer with disability. Majority of the people I found last year preferred to be termed disabled polar, but I think the differences, without getting into all the nuances there, it's about whether someone associates the disability as being a part of them, or as they are a person with a disability. So it comes down to individual preference. So if you're chatting to someone or utilizing terminology in third person, etc., I think it's just really helpful as an instructor to chat to your students, and if you need to, for this information, chat to them and find out whether what their terminology they prefer, because everyone is slightly different. But generally speaking, you can usually use the term disabled polar, and people relate to that and they feel comfortable. Okay, what I do want to explain though is that when it comes to disability, there are many different types of disability out there. There are neurological disabilities, there are neurodevelopmental disabilities, so there are things like autism, ADHD, etc. There are musculoskeletal injuries that then become disability over time. Pregnancy is technically deemed a disability, although it's a temporary disability, usually. There are limb difference disabilities, there are vision impairments, hearing impairments. There are so many different types of disability out there. Sorry if I missed any major ones there, but there are a lot. And I guess what I want to explain with this is that not all disabilities are visible, and it's quite an alarming fact that I think there was a report done years ago that only 7% of people actually recognise mental disability as a disability, and it's simply not true. So for anyone who has a neurodevelopmental disability, like I mentioned before, autism and ADHD are probably the two most commonly known there. They are very much so a disability. But also there are many musculoskeletal disabilities that may not be physically visible on first appearance, or even on second appearance. So I think I want to first of all, when we're talking about this space, explain that as an instructor, if you have been told that your student is disabled, but they physically don't look disabled, it doesn't make their disability less of a disability. for reference, someone who has a limb difference or utilizes a mobility aid, such as a wheelchair, doesn't mean that they're more disabled than someone who doesn't have a disability like that. Quite often within society, those who have invisible disabilities are viewed as less disabled, and they're often gaslit because of what's happening with them, or what their medical conditions, probably the better word there, because they can't do something, but on the outside they look able-bodied. And so they do experience a fair bit of I guess verbal discomfort from time to time. They basically just get gaslit, and it's not okay. So each individual will have their own disability affecting them in a different way, and comparing disabilities is never okay, is what I'm effectively trying to get at here. And it's really worthwhile also mentioning that disabilities do fluctuate from day to day for certain populations. So one individual may require the use of a walking aid one day, but the next day they look like they're functioning without any sort of restraint. So again, this doesn't make them any less disabled. So yeah, considering this, these when we're talking about disabilities, considering these factors when you're teaching a student is really important. So if someone's talking to you and telling you that they are disabled, please don't start looking for the obvious and thinking wheelchair, amputee, limb difference, etc., because not every disability looks like that. I know when we think about disability, we think about someone in a wheelchair, we think about the disabled icon, and in fact, it's a little bit more than that. So when it comes to disability, about 1 in 5 people have a disability, and about 20% of those are actually born with their disability. These are all, there's so many statistics I could have chosen, but this one particularly was one that hit close to home, and it's about 1 in 4 disabled people, so not polars, this research is people, say they frequently do not have choice or control over their daily lives. So I can really appreciate and understand that for anyone who is disabled but has the ability to pole dance, that this would be an amazing way for them to feel like they have some degree of choice and control. So I think it's really important for able-bodied people to do the best we can to facilitate the disabled community within this area, and to help in every way we can remove any barriers that may be impeding them for participation into pole dance. If we just talk about barriers for a second, I won't go into barriers for too long, but there are many different lines of thoughts in regards to barriers, and quite often or not, people go, well, this person can't pole dance because, they're in a wheelchair. They may be able to pole dance, but the barrier is society imposing in that situation, imposing limitations on the individual. So when we talk about barriers, we want to ensure that as able-bodied people, and even as non-able-bodied people, that we are doing our absolute best to eliminate these societal barriers. And that's what we can do as pole instructors, is ensure that there is basically no barriers there. Do our best to minimize barriers to stop that person from pole dancing. And sure, there may be some medical limitations and restrictions, barriers, but that will come down to the individual. But if we're also on top of those medical barriers, adding in additional barriers, then that person is never going to experience the freedom and joy and expression that we are able to achieve with pole dance. And I would like to think that one day we can get to a point where there are no medical barriers limiting an individual from participation in pole dance. And I know that's a very doe-eyed sort of view, but if someone is, paraplegic, for example, they have the use of part of their body, then we can maybe look at utilizing other, engineering degrees and build mechanics and systems and pulleys that will be able to assist as need be. Or, for maybe more so for quadriplegics, that they might be able to experience the joy of pole through the use of different apparatus. But yeah, again, that's obviously comes down to the individual as to whether they wanted to do that. But at the moment, there's a lot of barriers that would be stopping that person from participating. That is a very niche example there, but I digress. Back to the main points at hand. So if we talk about pole dance, pole dance is really, like I said, it's about expression and freedom of movement and joy, and it's really uniquely positioned in many ways to build confidence and improve quality of life and health and well-being within our community, and it really creates so many connections within our community. And there really, in pole dance, should be a room for everybody. But in reality, like I said, pole dance is currently not for everybody because there are physical barriers and limitations for people. If we can eliminate as many of these barriers as possible, then we allow for what we term inclusive practice. So inclusive practice is what we're trying to strive for in pole dance. So inclusive practice can be many different things, and it's usually defined as approaches or strategies or even like our attitudes, the things that we're doing to basically ensure that no one is excluded from what is available, what's on offer. So we're effectively trying to create a world where everyone feels welcome, they feel safe, they feel valued and accepted, that they and confident that they're going to get the assistance that they need to be able to support them on their journey. So when it comes to pole dance specifically, there are many different ways we can ensure inclusive practice as studio owners and pole instructors. And the first most important point will be communication. So communication is key when working with disabled polers. So at every stage of, a pole dancer's journey, you want to ensure that there is communication. You want to be open to, the whole process, and you want to be non-assumptive about what that person is able to do. So I think the best thing to do is really to ask open-ended questions, and lots of questions. So the more questions you ask of the individual as an instructor or a studio owner, the more you're going to be able to assist them. As a part of that, don't expect to ask questions and not get responses. So if they provide you a response, then you might need to act on that response. And part of that acting on it will be providing that individual with options, for X, Y, and Z, or, different choices for their learning style. So I think understanding that you've got to be open to critique as to things that you could do better as a studio owner, as an instructor. But I think ensuring that you've got really good open communication from the start is very helpful. So what this would look like is potentially, if you knew that a poler was coming in for the first time that was disabled, you would potentially call them up beforehand and have an open discussion with them as the studio manager or as the instructor, and figure out what their needs are and how you're best able to provide those, assist to provide those needs. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. It could be at the end of a class or during a class, talking to the poler, or during warm-up. If you've had someone come into warm-up and they may have a visible disability in this situation, you may pull them aside prior to warm-up, or you may pull them aside after warm-up and just quietly have a word to them one-on-one and ask what their individual needs are. Frequently checking in with them throughout the class and making sure that you're doing what you can to assist their learning needs, but obviously not to the detriment of every other student in the class either. You're not there to be a helicopter teacher and hover around that individual. You're there to ensure that every student in that class feels safe and comfortable. Other things to be aware of to help provide inclusive practice. So ensure that your communications, your style of communication, but also like the content of your communication, is empowering and it's respectful. So I think, and again, this is I've never experienced it, but I've definitely had a lot of disabled polers say that they've had a lot of assumptions made about them, or they've been told to do things. So a lot of commands that have been issued at them. So I think don't assume, speak to the polar, comes back to the communication point, find out what works for them, and allow for the process to be a collaboration. Certainly with disabled polars, you will be really required to collaborate and find out what works for them and their body. And we'll talk about again things a little bit later in terms of translating moves that work well for their body. But yeah, I think don't assume that someone can't do something or that they can do something. Chat to them, find out what works for them. And if they're completely new to pole, then it's going to be a learning journey for both of you. But if they are a pole dancer already and they've come in, starting a new studio or doing a drop-in class, then they will know. They will know so much more about their body than you will. So chat to them. As a part of all of this as well, in terms of inclusive practice, make sure that you are using inclusive language. So if you need to ask them about what terminology they prefer, ask them about their medical condition or their disability, ask them about bits and pieces that you might not know. Don't assume that, well, maybe because you've had a pole dancer in the past with MS that you know everything about MS. You are not a medical professional. I can assure you, probably won't know much about MS, even if you've had a pole dancer before with MS. So ask about it. And that obviously goes for all types of disability there. Certain disabilities may require certain needs, so you might need to offer additional breaks or frequent breaks. So for example, MS is a perfect example of students that usually need more frequent breaks after high bouts of intense exercise, or they can experience overheating quite quickly, so they may need those frequent breaks to cool down, or they might need to be positioned near an aircon or a fan in class to assist with their condition. So I think being aware of every individual's need and trying to do your best to facilitate that is a way to show inclusive practice. Other things to consider are with some neurodevelopmental disabilities or even musculoskeletal disabilities, some people might feel overwhelmed with longer combinations. So breaking movements into smaller chunks is very helpful. And also watching for anger, frustration, again, this goes kind of without saying with the able-bodied community, just watch for signs that things might not be quite right and just modify as appropriate for that individual. So if we come back to preparing for a new polar to come into your studio and you found out that they're disabled, let's talk about the process of that. First of all, if you know beforehand, that does help because you can do your own research. So learn about the condition, do your own research. There are obviously, you can pretty much Google everything online these days. Doesn't mean it's all correct, it most likely isn't, but you can at least have a basic understanding of what the medical condition is or the disability is. And then from there, do your own research on a personal level, ask questions. So like I said, call up that individual and then find out in their own words what the condition, disability is. So you may be told that it's MS, but then find out from them again. So learn it maybe medically, but learn it from their point of view. It really helps to know what they're experiencing from their point of view, because they may have, MS, but they might be only experiencing part of certain symptoms. And that information is really valuable to know. So asking those open-ended questions that I mentioned earlier is key. Asking things like, how do you best learn? What's your preferred learning style? There are a lot of polars out there who have sensory processing disorders who don't like being touched. So if you go to spot someone hands-on, they may freak out and it's just not appropriate for them. So asking, what's your preferred learning style? Do you prefer watching? Do you prefer being spotted? Someone who has a visual impairment, for example, is going to learn very differently compared to someone who has a hearing impairment. Someone with a hearing impairment, they will need to be able to read your lips. They will need to be placed at the front of the classroom. And when you're explaining things, it's not going to be helpful to have the music up because they will have all the vibrations, and they will hear background noise. For some of them will hear background noise. It'll be really hard for them to get the concepts across. So being really aware of these small things, asking the polar individually, what can I do to assist you with your learning process, and getting all of the information from them. And then asking them also, are there things that you don't like? Are there, is there anything that I might do that might make you feel uncomfortable or cause you pain or discomfort, or any movements that you physically just cannot do? So talk to the student, learn about what their limitations are, but also learn about what their goals and the desires are. Learn about what brought them to pole dance and what they're hoping to achieve. Building that rapport from the start with any polar. This is obviously doesn't go for purely the disabled community, but for any polar, building that rapport is really key to ensuring that they feel safe and protected and valued in our pole dance studios, and hopefully what we would create as a safe environment for them. With all of this, it's lovely to be able to plan in ahead, but sometimes things don't quite work like that. Expect things to go wrong, or expect things, maybe not go wrong, but expect random things to pop up. Expect that a patient, sorry, that's the physio in me, mainly because I've had this before, actually, just sidetrack. I once had a patient turn up to an appointment, and I had absolutely no prior warning of this, but had a very young gentleman in my waiting room sitting in a wheelchair. And I was a very young physio at that point in time. I had absolutely no information about this individual. And they, at the time, were experienced a permanent disability that basically rendered them in a wheelchair for the rest of their life. But I wasn't expecting that, and I didn't know what to do, and I had to be prepared for the unexpected in that situation. So it's unlikely that a pole dancer will show up to your studio without sussing out the studio beforehand, if they have a disability to that degree. But be prepared that if a student does come in with a disability, whether it's visible or not, that you are ready to work on the fly. So they themselves will usually turn up on the fly if they feel comfortable with their own body and movement pathways, and they know what to do. So if someone does turn up to class with a physical difference in appearance, please don't freak out. Don't sort of go, oh, what do I do? But there's also no need to jump on it straight away. You can let them, they'll come to you for assistance. They'll obviously let reception know. Reception, your desk admin will introduce you, and you can have a chat before class if need be. But if they are literally just turning into class, you can see how they go in their warm-up, see how you can observe from a distance and see what modifications they do, and you can learn a lot of information from observing them. So no need to panic is what I'm getting at here. But take a moment to acknowledge them and find the appropriate point of time in class to actually pull them aside and chat to them on that one-on-one situation. Ask them about their pole history, because they may feel very comfortable poling before, and you have had a moment of panic because you've seen a physical difference that you're not used to teaching. And I can appreciate that happens. In the ideal world, we get to a point where that doesn't happen, but I can definitely appreciate that that it will happen for many. But yeah, ask them about their pole history. Ask them about, are they still poling? How long ago was their last class? What level? What tricks were they working on? What do they like? What don't they like? What does their body do? What does their body not do? Ask them all of those questions. And that will really help you if someone does turn up unexpected to your class. Because let's face it, we wouldn't, I don't announce when I'm about to turn up to a pole studio as an able-bodied person. So there'll be so many disabled polers who'll turn up unannounced to pole studios. So they might not feel the need to, and that's completely fine. That's not an issue at all. But it's how you respond to the situation that's really important. Okay, let's talk about the main part of pole, which is the tricks. So we've gotten through warm-up, we've gotten through all the communication part, we're working really well as a team, and then we kind of come across our first real hurdle in terms of tricks. And I think a lot of the issue here comes down to kind of what I mentioned before, is that teachers, instructors and polers, they have to work together. It's a bit more of a collaboration, very much so when we're dealing with the disabled pole community and disabled aerial community. It really needs to be a collaboration. A lot of the time, instructors go wrong by trying to adapt movements to fit someone's body when their body's limitations don't allow for that. It's kind of like trying to fit a circle into a square peg, or the other way around, square peg into a circle. It just doesn't work. So then they might try to beat around the edges of the peg to try and make it fit, and that's kind of adapting it, and it doesn't still quite work for their body. So adapting a movement or adaptation effectively means that you're I'm making words up, adjusting or modifying a movement to basically still be the movement at the crux, but tweaking parts of it to fit that individual and their capabilities. And it's usually adjusting the conditions of the movement. The problem with adaptation is that usually implies that it kind of happens only in one direction. So the movement itself, it's kind of like you're trying to make the polar fit the move as opposed to make the move fit the polar, and it doesn't work really well with disabled bodies. So we like to utilize a different theory and methodology instead, which is more about translation. So if you think about the word translate, we usually think about different languages. We think about, I can say something in English and it can get translated into German and then translated back again. And there are so many different words. I used to speak German, that's why I'm using that as an example. There are so many words in the German language that don't actually have a true meaning in the English language, and vice versa, but you can find ways to explain them. So whilst they mean the same thing, they kind of are different. That's what translation is. So it's about changing changing the movement into a different movement that makes it feel like it's of the same value. So they may be, it might not be changing a movement, but it might be like, giving an alternative that feels like it is. So if, for example, a polar, they might not be able to perform an eagle with 2 arms, but they can do it with 1 arm. They both are standalone, very beautiful moves, but trying to, modify an eagle by giving a 2-arm version that doesn't quite fit the polar, that's trying to adapt the move, and that's not as effective in this situation. So when it comes to teaching, I think translation or translating movements is very helpful. And again, it comes down to collaboration with the polar and learning about their body. So they may come to you and say, I would love to learn this jade split. And so you try to teach them the jade split, and then you have to modify the movement to adapt it. So they may end up in a real weird looking shape, but instead you go, let's translate this move that works well to the limitations of your body. And they might do a stag leg jade. That's another example. So again, it's a standalone, it's a beautiful movement, but you're working within that polar's capabilities and then building it as they're able. Again, this is hopefully something that doesn't seem too far-fetched, because within the able-bodied community, I'd also like to think that there will be individuals who do not have capacity for certain movements, and so therefore we're constantly translating movements to make it work for their body. But yeah, I think kind of the concept and the theory is important to understand. So when it comes to tricks, learn what the polar is capable of and translate movements accordingly to their body. Don't just try to make the movements work or for the body, and it just doesn't feel right. explained that terribly. Try not to fit the poler into the movement. Try to translate the movement to the pole dancer. That's what I'm trying to get at there. All right, we're doing very well. There's one last big topic I really want to talk about, and I guess it's two in one, and that is ableism and inspiration. So we'll talk about ableism first. So ableism is something that is experienced by disabled persons or persons with disabilities, and usually it's experienced way too often, often on a daily basis, but ideally they don't experience it at all. But again, being my idealist self. So for anyone who doesn't know what ableism is, it's effectively discrimination of the disabled community or disabled individual in favour of an able-bodied person or people. It is effectively perpetuating this negative view of disability, and it's a form of oppression. Strong word, but really is, and it affects people who identify as disabled, as well as anyone else who others perceive to be disabled based on the way they look. So it's a really important term to understand, and also to recognise when it's occurring in day-to-day life, and when appropriate to speak out against it. So in the pole community, ableism takes form in many different ways. Here are a few different examples, though, of what you may see. So one that I saw quite a lot of during that blog period last year, towards the end of the year, was people commenting that someone did not look disabled, and they commented it as if it's a compliment. And I know that the intent behind it, and I know intent matters, and that's the important bit. So I know the intent was never malicious when they're commenting those things. But if you're telling a person that they don't look disabled, you're implying that their disability, they're kind of making it up. But you're also devaluing those who don't have a visible disability as well. It's really important that we recognise disabilities as they are, and whether that's a visible disability or a non-visible disability, it's important that they're recognised and that they are seen, because a lot of the time people don't like to see things that make them feel uncomfortable. They basically try to put them away in a little tiny space in their brain, so they're not confronted with things that make them feel uncomfortable. And it's important that we get uncomfortable to eventually get comfortable. So if you are trying to make yourself feel calmer by saying, oh, you don't look that disabled, that's not okay. That's a very ableist thing to say. So we definitely want to be pulling people up on that sort of language. So if your students are saying that to someone because they've just managed to climb to the top of the pole, being like, oh, you don't look that disabled, that's something that needs to be quietly pulled out to the side, and maybe chat to that student later and say, hey, that's actually a very ableist comment, and explaining why. And it would make that person potentially, and it depends on the individual, obviously, in this situation. That disabled poler might feel fine with it, but a lot of disabled polers would potentially feel uncomfortable with that sort of statement, as would potentially all the students or many of the students around them. Another form of ableism, or another example of ableism, is viewing polers that or disabled polers or polers with disabilities, viewing them as weak or vulnerable, or in need of rescuing. So this again is potentially where some of that discomfort in our brains come from. But if you see someone in a wheelchair, it's programmed in many ways, in a very negative way, that we view people in wheelchairs as need of help and rescuing, and that simply isn't the case. Now, that's a wheelchair example. Let's talk about someone who is maybe has a developmental disability. They physically maybe look able-bodied, so they don't maybe get viewed as weak or vulnerable and need of rescuing, but they may need more assistance than the person that's in the wheelchair. So I think when it comes to talking to polers, please never use those words as to, you know, oh, it looks like you need some help. If that person is very clearly visibly capable of doing an activity, if they do require assistance, you can ask, would you like some assistance? Instead of looks like you need some help. I think it's just the way you go about things, but also mentally, if you see someone and because they're physically disabled and visibly disabled, you automatically assume that they are weak and vulnerable, then that's your own bias, and that's something to reconsider, because that's a very ableist point of view. All right, next on my list, going the opposite way is viewing a disabled polar as superhuman. So going from very one extreme, from weak and vulnerable and in need of rescuing, to like, oh my God, they're incredible, they're amazing, they are like the strongest person in the world. And viewing them as a source of your personal inspiration simply because they are disabled. Now, we're going to talk about inspiration in a little bit, because there's a fair bit that comes with this backstory there. But understanding that we are allowed to be inspired by those around us, there is nothing wrong with that. But putting someone on a pedestal and viewing them as superhuman purely because they are disabled can come across as ableist. I'll leave that, I'll put a pin in that for the moment, and I'll unpin it in a hot minute. Next up, we have the class and the pole structure and the format of what you're walking into. So quite often studios can be ableist, and this is very much so an Australian thing. I'm not too sure how it goes overseas as much. I know that Deb Roach has spoken many a time about how UK pole system and maybe even some European countries are a lot less ableist in their structure. So in Australia, we have levels that require passing before moving on to the next level and so forth. So it can be very ableist in nature, having those levels. So for example, Deb is probably the perfect person to talk about, because she's been very public about this. Many years ago, she basically quit pole because she could not Jamila. And for those of you who don't know Deb, she has a limb difference. Making a Jamila shape with her body was physically very challenging for her to do. And she wasn't able to pass her level because she couldn't do a Jamila. But yet she had so much more within her that she could do many other tricks that were at higher levels, but she was being held back or stopped effectively in her pole progress because she could not perform a Jamila, which we now think is like, we just see that and just think, how ridiculous is that? Because, you know, Deb has gone on to be one of Australia's most successful polers. So I think being really aware that class structures and formats, and particularly structured class syllabuses, can actually be ableist is a really good insight to have. And looking at alternative ways to structure your class system to ensure it accommodates individuals of all abilities is helpful. A couple other things that are ableist in nature, comparing disabled polers based off visible disabilities. We've talked about this before. So thinking a person doesn't look disabled enough because they maybe visibly don't show a disability, that's very ableist. Not having disabled access, like no access ramp for studios that require steps into a studio, that's not okay. So ensuring that you have structures in place, physical barriers are removed, as in barriers to exercise is removed. Ensuring that that's taken care of is needed to ensure you're an inclusive studio. And lastly, unfortunately, I've heard of this occurring, although it is far and few between, which is good. But I have heard of polers being refused to be taught simply because they are disabled, or studios that have failed to make accommodations to understand that individual's disability. Where, you know, we're well into the 21st century. This shouldn't be happening anymore. We should not be refusing people to be taught. If you yourself as an instructor don't feel like you have the abilities to teach someone who is disabled, then there are so many other ways to go about it. And they might be including upskilling yourself and explaining to the poler, open discussion with the poler, so finding out, and you might actually realize that you do have those abilities, or alternatively looking at another instructor within your studio. But I think that blanket refusals of instruction is really quite poor within this day and age. I think every instructor out there should feel comfortable teaching a disabled poler, regardless of whether they're a beginner instructor or a professional instructor that's been poling for many years. All right, unpinning the inspiration caution discussion. So let's talk about this. So pole dancers, not disabled pole dancers, but just pole dancers in general, are inspiring. We are an incredible breed of people who do extreme movements on a vertical apparatus, and it's damn hard. So yeah, absolutely, we should be inspired by what we see within the pole community, and certainly that follows on into the disabled pole community. And a lot of the research I've done over the last 4 to 6 months, this comes directly from the disabled pole community. So this is not my personal opinion. This is the overwhelming view that I've gotten from the disabled pole community, and individuals within that community might feel different, like I mentioned at the start, but this is the overwhelming feedback that I received, and it's that disabled pole dancers don't want to be able-bodied inspiration. So they don't want to be your inspiration, and there's, I think, a little bit of a difference as to understanding this, because it took quite a while for me to process my head around this. They don't want to hear excuse-based inspiration points. So things like, well, this poler who's disabled can climb to the top of the pole, so I shouldn't have any excuses to be able to climb. So comparing yourself or another individual to a pole dancer with a disability as inspiration it's not okay. You're effectively implying through these words that, one, they're less than you because of their disability, and two, that their disability should be the primary motivation for you to be able to climb that pole, and that you're physically more capable of them, so you should be able to. So none of that is okay. Again, it comes down to the intent. The intent is never to harm with these words. They're not meant to be malicious, but many within the disabled pole community don't appreciate the sentiment behind these statements still. So the resounding message that I've received is that they feel like these sort of statements are objectification, and it's objectification that they don't ask for. They feel that they're not polling to make you feel better about yourself. This is directly towards able-bodied people, by the way. That they're not polling to make you feel better about yourself or your life circumstances. They're polling for themselves. And a lot of the time people see disabled pollers with physical disabilities and they feel sorry for them, or just disabled people and they feel sorry for them. And this is where a lot of these emotions come from. They don't poll to make you feel better, because a lot of people go, oh, that person who's doing X, Y, and Z on a pole, like, that's incredible. What an inspiration. It is incredible. We can be absolutely inspired by that individual's strength, their beauty, and their art form. We don't need to disregard all the barriers that they've overcome to be able to pole dance, because most of the time society has placed these barriers on them, and they've overcome a lot to be able to achieve what they can. But it also doesn't mean that we put them on a pedestal either and start going, this person is superhuman, when they are just learning how to climb a pole for a first time. They are incredible, absolutely, but comparing yourself to that individual is often what they don't want, and they don't want to be viewed, it's a bit of a controversial term, but the inspiration porn is one that's been thrown about in the last 6 months, and I know that there will be a lot of people within the sex work community who don't like that term, and I've spoken to many within the sex work community who actually do appreciate that term. So again, it comes down to personal. I don't know if it's the right term to use, but it's there. But basically they do not want you to think about them as your individuation, They do not want you to think about them as your inspiration to move yourself forward within your own personal pole journey. They want you to feel inspired by their movements and their art and their beauty, just like you would by any other individual pole dancer there, regardless of their disability. So if you can appreciate, yes, they are disabled, but let's just focus on their talent and their art, and that's what inspires me. That's kind of the key here. It shouldn't be that you're inspired out of sympathy, effectively. There's a lot there to unpack, and I know that people will feel very strongly about that. I'm not trying to rub people up the wrong way in terms of different points of view. There's a lot to chat about, but as I said, I'm not disabled myself, so I have never been on the receiving end of any of these experiences. So I'm trying my best to I guess, provide across a point of view that I have not been on the receiving end of. And certainly this is discussion that made me think a lot in the last 6 months as to how I respond to certain populations within the pole community, and it's made me change the way I interact to some degree with the disabled pole community. I certainly don't think I was doing anything to any of those extremes beforehand, but it certainly has really made me question the way I term things going forward. So I would like to think that as individuals, we're all doing our best to constantly improve ourselves, and I'm no different here. So always open to discussion, positive and constructive discussion as well. So just trying to make sure that I've not missed anything there. Yeah. All right. I'm going to leave the discussion on inspiration for the moment, and I think I'd like to leave you with my five key points when we talk about disability. I think we've talked for a lot today as to considerations for instructors for when they're teaching pole dancers, but I've got my 5 key points or summaries from today. So first is that disability is not a dirty word. It is okay to say. So we said that at the start. Ask the individual if they prefer the term disabled polar, polar with disability. If they prefer parapolar is the other one. Ask before assuming is it's key there. Second point is not all disabilities are visible. So just because someone doesn't have a visible disability, it doesn't mean that they're making it up or that they're less disabled than someone who has a visible disability. Point number 3, disabled polars, like all polars, are inspiring because of their individual skill, talent and resilience. Don't compare their disabilities against each other as disabled polars, or use their disability alone as an inspiration for your own personal journey. You can be inspired, but it's about how you go about being inspired, if that makes sense. And tying into that is ableism. So that's point number 4. Ableism is unfortunately widespread in pole dance community. So as a studio or a polar, ensure you are providing a really supportive and accessible environment to pole dance, so that we can help lift up and support the disabled and aerial pole community. Lastly, I haven't talked about this too much, but disabled polars are often belong to minority groups, and really marginalized minority groups. So intersectionality, cannot speak today, intersectionality, still said that wrong, but intersectionality matters. There we go, got it out. So be really aware that there are a high number of disabilities within the LGBTQIA+ community, as well as the Black community. So be really aware and ensure that your studio is as supportive as you can be of certain minority groups. Yeah, all minority groups really. And I guess this is, I've really kind of spoken today almost to able-bodied people when I'm talking, and I appreciate that there'll be probably the majority of the audience will probably be disabled bodied people. So thank you for listening for those, regardless of your abilities, thank you for listening, taking the time out of your day to actually educate yourself. For those who aren't aware of any of this, and for those who are, thank you for taking the time to listen and hopefully reflect on things I'm saying, and hopefully providing some helpful comments in the feedback section below. But for those of you who are disabled and are not currently pole dancing because you've never tried it before, I hope that you seeing this video helps you to feel encouraged, because being disabled should being disabled should not discourage you from participating in pole. There will be limitations, there'll be challenges that you'll come up against, but with creative thinking on your behalf, as well as your instructor's behalf, and lots of hard work, you'll be able to find movements that you can, translate that will suit your body. So pole is not for everybody out there. We like to think it is, but it's not. But certainly for those who are able to get the right support from those around them and the right environment, it will certainly help. So with that, I will finish my chat today on considerations when teaching a disabled poler. I hope you have found this helpful, insightful, and answers a lot of questions that you had towards the end of last year when we released our blog. There's obviously, like I said, a lot of discussion, a lot of personal opinions, individual opinions on a whole bunch of different things we've talked about today. But again, I'd like to reiterate that all of the research, and there was a lot of research done last year from so many disabled polers within our community, is that what I've presented to you today is the overwhelming opinion of a high majority of them. One last thing, I would like to apologise about the captions, or the lack thereof of captions for these videos. Unfortunately, Zoom's function when I've filmed these recordings did not make the captions accessible. So it's something that I'm working on, and I've contacted Zoom about, and I appreciate that there'll be many who are hard of hearing that would have loved to have watched these particular videos, and it's something that was flagged right from the beginning, but we will endeavour to hopefully make those changes for future videos. Anyway, on that note, thank you for joining me for the final Cafe Summer Series. I will do a closing video shortly as a final farewell, but I really hope that you got a lot out of this presentation. Thanks, everyone.